From the depths of human history, demons have terrorized, possessed, and haunted our species in ways that defy explanation. What you're about to hear are 33 of the most documented, most terrifying, and most bone-chilling encounters with the supernatural forces that lurk in the shadows of our world. These aren't just stories passed down through generations or urban legends whispered around campfires. These are real accounts, witnessed by real people, documented by investigators, and in some cases recorded on audio and video for the world to see. The cases I'm sharing with you today represent decades of research, official investigations, and testimonies from witnesses whose lives were forever changed by their encounters with the demonic. From the infamous Anneliese Michel exorcism that shocked Germany to the Bell Witch haunting that made Tennessee the only state to officially recognize a death caused by supernatural forces, these encounters span continents, cultures, and centuries. What makes these cases particularly chilling isn't just the terror they inflicted on their victims, but the sheer amount of evidence that supports their authenticity. We're talking about police reports, medical records, audio recordings, photographs, and witness testimonies from multiple credible sources. These aren't isolated incidents happening to unreliable narrators. These are well-documented events that have baffled investigators, scientists, and skeptics for decades. Dr. Richard Gallagher, who has consulted on demonic possession cases for over 25 years, estimates he's seen more cases of possession than any other physician in the world. His professional opinion? There are forces at work that go beyond the boundaries of psychiatry and medical science. When a 90-pound woman can throw a 200-pound deacon across a room. As Dr. Gallagher witnessed, we're dealing with something that transcends normal human capabilities. The encounters you're about to hear follow disturbing patterns that appear again and again across different cultures, time periods, and geographical locations. The first phase typically involves what experts call infestation, where the demonic presence makes itself known through subtle signs. Witnesses report seeing shadowy figures that melt away like liquid, overwhelming sulfur smells, voices that sound distant and choppy, and an inexplicable sense of dread that seems to seep into the very walls of their homes. But these entities don't just make brief appearances and disappear. Harassment and oppression represent the most common and, in many ways, the most terrifying form of demonic activity. The devil doesn't enter someone's life at a definitive point and then make a clean departure. He hangs around untiringly for months or even years, slowly wearing down his victim's sanity and will to resist. What's particularly disturbing about these cases is how the supernatural activity often escalates in response to the victim's attempts to fight back. Prayer, which initially provides some relief, eventually becomes insufficient. Religious objects that once offered protection begin to lose their power. The entities seem to adapt, learning their victims' fears and using them as weapons. The Anneliese Michel case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented demonic possessions in modern history. This young German woman underwent 67 Catholic exorcism rites over the course of nearly a year. What makes her case so compelling isn't just the tragic outcome, but the extensive audio recordings that captured the voices of multiple entities claiming to possess her. These recordings, made at Anneliese's own request so the world would have proof that demons were real, reveal voices speaking in languages she had never learned, claiming to be historical figures including Lucifer himself. The priests performing the exorcisms, Ernst Alt and Arnold Rentz, documented everything meticulously. They recorded hours of sessions where Anneliese spoke in deep, guttural voices that bore no resemblance to her natural speech patterns. She demonstrated knowledge of events and people she had never encountered, spoke in ancient dialects, and displayed physical strength that defied her deteriorating condition. But Germany isn't the only country where such encounters have been documented with extraordinary detail. The Enfield poltergeist case in England became one of the most witnessed and thoroughly investigated paranormal events in history. For over 2 years, the Hodgson family endured supernatural activity that was observed and documented by members of the Society for Psychical Research, police officers, journalists, and neighbors. The activity centered around 11-year-old Janet Hodgson, who would enter trance-like states and speak in the voice of Bill Wilkins, a man who had died in the house years earlier. Investigators confirmed that a man by that name had indeed lived in the home and died of a hemorrhage while sitting in the living room. The voice that came from Janet was that of an elderly man, complete with the appropriate accent and mannerisms, despite Janet being a young girl from North London. Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, the SPR investigators who spent months documenting the case, captured hundreds of hours of audio recordings and took countless photographs of the phenomena. They witnessed furniture moving on its own, objects flying across rooms, and voices emanating from Janet that continued even when her mouth was sealed with tape. While they caught the children faking some incidents, both investigators maintained that the majority of the activity was genuine and unexplainable. The documentation from the Enfield case is so extensive that researchers have spent decades analyzing the evidence. The sheer volume of evidence makes it nearly impossible to dismiss the entire case as fraud or misidentification. Across the Atlantic, the Bell Witch haunting of Tennessee has earned the distinction of being called the most documented supernatural event in American history. From 1817 to 1821, the Bell family and their community were terrorized by an entity that could speak, move objects, and demonstrate knowledge of events happening miles away. The spirit, which called itself Kate, made threats against John Bell's life and ultimately claimed responsibility for his death. What sets the Bell Witch case apart is the number of credible witnesses who encountered the entity. Neighbors, family friends, and even future President Andrew Jackson reportedly experienced the phenomena firsthand. The creature could carry on conversations, answer questions about distant events, and demonstrate knowledge that no human in the area could possess. When John Bell died on December 20th, 1820, a vial containing an unknown substance was found beside his deathbed, and the entity claimed responsibility for his poisoning. The case is so well documented that Tennessee remains the only state to officially recognize a person's death as being caused by supernatural forces. Multiple written accounts from different witnesses corroborate the same extraordinary events, making it nearly impossible to dismiss as folklore or exaggeration. These historical cases establish patterns that continue to appear in modern encounters. The demonic entities seem to follow similar methods of operation, regardless of time period or location. They begin with subtle manifestations designed to test their victims' reactions. They gradually escalate their activity, feeding off fear and negative emotions. They demonstrate knowledge and abilities that exceed normal human capabilities, and they show a particular interest in tormenting those who attempt to document or resist their presence. Dr. Richard Gallagher's modern cases echo the same phenomena reported centuries ago. He describes patients who speak in languages they've never learned, demonstrate knowledge of events they couldn't possibly know about, and exhibit physical strength that defies medical explanation. In one case, a woman who weighed less than 100 pounds physically overpowered multiple adults attempting to restrain her. These aren't psychiatric symptoms, as Dr. Gallagher notes. They're manifestations of something that goes beyond the scope of medical science. The geographic distribution of these encounters reveals another disturbing pattern. While paranormal researchers initially expected most cases to come from regions with strong supernatural traditions, they've discovered that demonic encounters occur worldwide, cutting across all cultural and religious boundaries. From the remote mountains of Mexico, where Reverend Charles Carpenter has witnessed the effects of occult practices on his parishioners, to the suburbs of California, where the Doris Bither case terrified investigators with its violent manifestations, these entities seem to operate without regard for human borders or belief systems. What's particularly chilling about the Doris Bither case, which inspired the movie The Entity, is how the supernatural activity followed the family wherever they moved. Parapsychologists Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor documented physical attacks that left visible bruises on Bither's body, accompanied by poltergeist activity that included objects moving on their own and strange lights appearing throughout the house. The investigators noted that the phenomena seemed to be connected to Bither herself, following her from location to location regardless of how far she traveled. This pattern of supernatural attachment appears in case after case. The entities don't seem limited by physical locations or geographical boundaries. They form connections with their victims that transcend normal understanding of space and time. Families report that moving to new homes, even in different states, doesn't provide escape from the harassment. The activity simply resumes in the new location, often intensifying as if the entity is angered by the attempt to flee. The Roland Doe case, which inspired William Peter Blatty's novel The Exorcist, demonstrates how these attachments can form seemingly innocent beginnings. The 14-year-old boy, whose real identity was later revealed as Ronald Edwin Hunkeler, began experiencing supernatural activity after his aunt introduced him to a Ouija board. What started as minor disturbances in the family's Maryland home eventually escalated to full possession, requiring multiple exorcisms by Catholic priests. The documentation of Roland's case includes detailed notes from attending priests who recorded 48 witnesses to the exorcism proceedings. The boy demonstrated classic signs of demonic possession, including speaking in languages he didn't know, exhibiting supernatural strength, and displaying knowledge of events and people he had never encountered. Scratches and words would appear on his body in places he couldn't reach, and his behavior would change dramatically during the possession episodes. What makes Roland's case particularly significant is how it illustrates the progression from initial contact to full possession. The entity gained entry through what seemed like harmless experimentation with the supernatural, then gradually increased its influence over the boy's life. This pattern appears repeatedly in documented cases, suggesting that demons require some form of invitation or opening to establish their presence in a person's life. The progression typically follows predictable stages. Initial contact often involves seemingly innocent activities like using Ouija boards, attending seances, or experimenting with occult practices. The entity begins with subtle manifestations designed to establish its presence without causing immediate alarm. As the victim becomes accustomed to the activity, the manifestations intensify. The entity begins to demonstrate its power through increasingly dramatic displays. Physical objects move, unexplained sounds occur, and the victim begins to experience direct interaction with the presence. The harassment phase can last for months or years, during which the entity systematically breaks down the victim's psychological defenses. Sleep deprivation, constant fear, and social isolation all contribute to weakening the person's ability to resist. The entity often targets the victim's faith, mocking religious beliefs and making sacred objects or practices ineffective. This psychological warfare is designed to create despair and hopelessness, making the victim more susceptible to the entity's ultimate goal. Full possession represents the final stage, where the entity achieves complete control over the victim's body and mind. The possessed person's personality changes dramatically, often speaking in voices completely different from their own. They may demonstrate knowledge of languages, events, or people they've never encountered. Physical changes can include altered facial features, unusual strength, and the ability to withstand pain or injury that would incapacitate a normal person. Medical professionals who have studied these cases struggle to find conventional explanations for the phenomena they observe. Dr. Gallagher notes that while mental illness can produce some similar symptoms, the supernatural aspects of true possession cases go far beyond anything psychiatry can explain. When patients accurately describe events happening in distant locations, speak fluently in languages they've never studied, or demonstrate physical capabilities that exceed human limitations, medical science reaches its boundaries. The Catholic Church has developed extensive protocols for distinguishing between mental illness and genuine demonic possession. These guidelines, refined over centuries of experience, require multiple forms of evidence before authorizing an exorcism. The suspected victim must demonstrate knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means, display physical abilities that exceed human capabilities, speak in languages they've never learned, or show violent aversion to sacred objects while in an altered state of consciousness. Even with these strict criteria, the Church performs hundreds of exorcisms annually worldwide. Father José Antonio Fortea, one of the Catholic Church's leading experts on exorcism, has documented thousands of cases throughout his career. He notes that genuine possessions follow consistent patterns regardless of the victim's cultural background or religious beliefs, suggesting that these entities operate according to their own consistent rules and methods. The audio and video evidence from documented cases provides some of the most compelling proof of demonic activity. The recordings from Annalise Michel's exorcisms capture voices that bear no resemblance to her natural speech patterns, speaking in dialects and languages she had never encountered. The Enfield poltergeist tapes contain hours of conversations with entities claiming to be deceased individuals, providing information that the young mediums couldn't have known through normal means. These recordings have been subjected to extensive analysis by voice recognition experts, linguists, and audio specialists. While skeptics argue that the voices could be produced through ventriloquism or deliberate deception, the technical analysis reveals characteristics that would be extremely difficult to fake. The vocal patterns, linguistic structures, and emotional content of the supernatural voices show consistency that would require extraordinary acting ability to maintain over extended periods. Photographic evidence from these cases presents another layer of documentation that challenges conventional explanation. Images from the Bell Witch case show furniture arranged in impossible configurations, with heavy objects balanced in ways that defy gravity. Photographs from the Enfield investigation capture children in mid-levitation, with their bodies positioned in ways that would be impossible to achieve through jumping or other normal means. Physical evidence includes scratches and markings that appear on victims' bodies in locations they couldn't reach themselves, often forming words or symbols in languages the victims don't understand. The medical documentation from possession cases reveals physical changes that exceed normal human capabilities. Victims demonstrate strength that allows them to overpower multiple adults despite their own small stature or weakened condition. They show resistance to pain that would normally cause unconsciousness, continuing to function normally despite injuries that should be debilitating. Their vital signs often show abnormalities that should be life-threatening, yet they remain conscious and active throughout the possession episodes. Hospital records from these cases document medical anomalies that physicians struggle to explain through conventional diagnoses. Blood tests reveal chemical imbalances that should cause immediate organ failure, yet the patients show no signs of distress. Brain scans during possession episodes show activity patterns unlike anything seen in normal psychiatric conditions. The medical evidence supports the supernatural explanation when conventional medicine fails to account for the observed phenomena. The psychological impact on witnesses to these events often provides additional evidence of their authenticity. Police officers, medical professionals, clergy members, and other trained observers who encounter genuine demonic activity report lasting trauma from their experiences. These are individuals whose professional training prepares them to deal with extreme situations, yet they describe the supernatural encounters as unlike anything in their previous experience. Detective work on these cases often reveals historical connections that the victims couldn't have known about through normal research. Properties where demonic activity occurs frequently have histories of occult practices, violent deaths, or other traumatic events. The entities often demonstrate detailed knowledge of these historical events, providing information that can be verified through official records but wasn't known to the current occupants. The Doris Bither case illustrates this pattern perfectly. Investigation into the history of her Culver City home revealed previous incidents of supernatural activity reported by earlier residents. The entities plaguing Bither demonstrated knowledge of events that had occurred in the house decades before she moved in, information that wasn't available through public records or neighborhood gossip. Research into demonic encounters reveals that certain locations seem to attract or harbor supernatural activity, regardless of who lives there. These places often have histories of occult practices, violent crimes, or other traumatic events that seem to create openings for demonic entities to establish themselves. Once established, these entities can remain dormant for years before manifesting when conditions are favorable. The environmental factors that seem to trigger demonic activity include emotional trauma, occult experimentation, substance abuse, and periods of spiritual vulnerability. Victims often report that their encounters began during times of personal crisis, when their normal psychological defenses were weakened. The evidence becomes even more disturbing when we examine cases where demons have demonstrated their ability to manipulate the physical world in ways that defy natural law. The Enfield poltergeist in London represents perhaps the most thoroughly documented case of demonic manifestation in modern history. Between 1977 and 1979, sisters Janet and Margaret Hodgson, aged 11 and 13, became the focal point of phenomena that would challenge every skeptic who witnessed it firsthand. What began as simple knocking sounds escalated into full-scale physical attacks. Janet would enter trance-like states, speaking in the deep, gravelly voice of Bill Wilkins, a man who had died in the house years earlier. But this wasn't just voice-throwing or childhood imagination. The Society for Psychical Research documented furniture moving without human contact, objects flying across rooms, and most terrifyingly, Janet herself being physically thrown from her bed with such force that she would land several feet away. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, experienced paranormal investigators, captured hours of audio and video evidence. They recorded Janet speaking in languages she didn't know, demonstrating knowledge of events that occurred before her birth, and exhibiting physical strength that was impossible for her small frame. When skeptics suggested the children were faking the phenomena, the investigators caught them in the act of bending spoons themselves. But here's what's chilling. Janet later admitted they only faked about 2% of the incidents, just to see if the investigators would catch them. They always did. The remaining 98% remained unexplained. The demonic entity in Enfield wasn't content to simply haunt. It communicated, answering questions about its identity and expressing rage when challenged. It threw investigators across rooms, left bite marks on the children, and demonstrated an intelligence that was calculating and malevolent. This wasn't random poltergeist activity. This was a conscious, evil presence that had taken residence in that house and was systematically tormenting everyone inside. Moving from England to America, we encounter the Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee, which remains the only officially recognized supernatural death in United States history. From 1817 to 1821, the Bell family endured what can only be described as a demonic siege. The entity that tormented them possessed abilities that seemed almost godlike in their scope. It could appear simultaneously in multiple locations, speak in different voices, and demonstrate knowledge of events happening hundreds of miles away. But the Bell Witch wasn't content with simple harassment. It made a vow to kill John Bell, the family patriarch, and it followed through on that promise. On December 20, 1820, John Bell was found dead in his bed with a mysterious vial of black liquid nearby. When the family cat was given a drop of the substance, it died instantly. The Bell Witch gleefully took credit for the poisoning, claiming it had slipped John Bell the fatal dose while he slept. What makes the Bell Witch case particularly compelling is the sheer number of witnesses. Neighbors, local officials, and even future President Andrew Jackson visited the Bell farm and experienced the phenomena firsthand. Jackson himself fled the property after his horses refused to move, and his men were physically attacked by an invisible force. The entity would speak to large groups, answering questions and demonstrating knowledge that no human could possess. The Bell Witch displayed the classic hallmarks of demonic intelligence. It was patient, strategic, and utterly without mercy. It targeted the family's youngest daughter, Betsy, with particular cruelty, beating her unconscious and leaving physical marks on her body. When the family tried to seek help from their church, the entity would follow them, disrupting services and terrorizing the congregation. It seemed to feed on their fear and desperation, growing stronger with each passing month. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these documented cases is how the demons adapt to resistance. When the Lutz family fled their Amityville home after 28 days of terror, they discovered that changing locations provided no escape. The entity had attached itself to them, not the house. George Lutz reported waking up at exactly 3:15 a.m. every morning, the same time the DeFeo murders had occurred. The family was followed by swarms of flies in the dead of winter, experienced dramatic temperature drops in specific rooms, and witnessed green slime oozing from walls and keyholes. Skeptics have attempted to debunk the Amityville case, claiming it was fabricated for profit. But polygraph tests conducted by top experts found no evidence of deception in the Lutz family's accounts. More importantly, the phenomena they described matches patterns seen in dozens of other documented cases across different cultures and time periods. The demons don't seem to care about publicity or profit. They care about possession and destruction. The case of Doris Bither, investigated by UCLA parapsychologists in 1974, reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of demonic encounters: their sexual and violent nature. Bither reported being repeatedly attacked and assaulted by 3 invisible entities, 2 smaller ones that would hold her down while a larger one violated her. The attacks left physical bruises and marks that investigators documented and photographed. Dr. Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor spent 10 weeks investigating Bither's claims, witnessing poltergeist activity, strange lights, and unexplained phenomena. What they discovered was a pattern of escalating violence that seemed designed to break down Bither's psychological defenses. The entities weren't just tormenting her physically, they were systematically destroying her sense of safety and sanity. The demons in Bither's case demonstrated the same intelligence and persistence seen in other documented encounters. They followed her family from location to location, adapting their tactics to each new environment. When she moved to different states, the phenomena continued unabated. The entities seemed to understand that she was most vulnerable when isolated and afraid, timing their attacks for maximum psychological impact. What unites all these cases is the systematic nature of demonic harassment. These aren't random hauntings or residual energy from past traumas. These are calculated campaigns of terror conducted by intelligent, malevolent entities that seem to understand human psychology better than most therapists. They target vulnerabilities, exploit fears, and gradually escalate their attacks until their victims are completely broken. The evidence from Roland Doe's exorcism, the real-life inspiration for The Exorcist, provides crucial insight into how demons operate once they've achieved possession. The 14-year-old boy exhibited superhuman strength, spoke in ancient languages, and demonstrated knowledge of events and people he couldn't possibly have known about. But most disturbing were the physical manifestations. Words and symbols appearing on his skin, furniture moving without contact, and temperature drops so severe they could be measured with instruments. 48 people witnessed Roland's exorcism, including 9 Jesuits trained in dealing with supernatural phenomena. These weren't gullible believers or attention-seeking witnesses. They were educated professionals who documented everything they observed. The boy's body showed scratches and markings that appeared spontaneously, often spelling out words or forming symbols associated with demonic imagery. The demons possessing Roland seemed to understand exactly how to maximize terror and confusion. They would make the boy speak in the voices of deceased relatives, providing intimate details about family secrets and private conversations. They demonstrated knowledge of Latin and Aramaic that the boy had never studied. Most chillingly, they seemed to know personal details about each person present at the exorcism, using that information to taunt and threaten the witnesses. Dr. Richard Gallagher, who has consulted on demonic possession cases for over 25 years, estimates he has encountered more cases of genuine possession than any other physician in the world. His clinical observations provide crucial insight into how demons operate. He describes witnessing a 90-pound woman throw a 200-pound man across a room, patients speaking in ancient languages they had never learned, and individuals demonstrating knowledge of events happening in distant locations. What makes Dr. Gallagher's testimony particularly compelling is his medical background and initial skepticism. He approaches each case with rigorous scientific methodology, ruling out mental illness, fraud, and natural explanations before considering supernatural causes. Yet in case after case, he has encountered phenomena that defy medical explanation. The demons he has observed display intelligence, personality, and knowledge that cannot be attributed to the human hosts they possess. The patterns Dr. Gallagher describes match those documented in historical cases spanning centuries and cultures. The demons begin with subtle influence, gradually increasing their control until they achieve full possession. They demonstrate knowledge of languages, events, and people that the possessed individual couldn't possibly know. They exhibit superhuman strength and endurance, and they seem to understand exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage on their victims and witnesses. Perhaps most disturbing is the revelation that demons appear to be increasing their activity in modern times. Exorcists around the world report a dramatic rise in requests for help, with cases becoming more violent and persistent than in previous decades. The entities seem to be adapting to modern technology and psychological understanding, using social media, electronic devices, and advanced manipulation techniques to ensnare new victims. The documented evidence from these cases provides a clear picture of demonic methodology. They begin by exploiting existing vulnerabilities, trauma, depression, addiction, or involvement in occult practices. They gradually increase their influence, moving from harassment to oppression to full possession. They target not just their primary victims, but everyone connected to them, spreading fear and confusion throughout families and communities. What makes these entities so dangerous is their patience and intelligence. They don't simply attack randomly. They study their targets, learning their fears, relationships, and psychological weak points. They use this knowledge to craft personalized campaigns of terror designed to break down their victims' defenses and resistance. They understand that humans are social creatures, so they often target multiple family members simultaneously, creating chaos and preventing effective support systems from forming. The Roland Doe case, which occurred in the late 1940s and inspired William Peter Blatty's novel The Exorcist, stands as one of the most documented demonic possession cases in American history. This 14-year-old boy, whose real identity was later revealed as Ronald Edwin Hunkeler, became the center of an extraordinary supernatural investigation that would forever change how we understand demonic encounters. The case began innocuously enough when young Roland started experimenting with a Ouija board under the guidance of his spiritualist Aunt Harriet. After her sudden death, the family home in Cottage City, Maryland, became a battleground between the natural and supernatural worlds. Strange noises echoed through the house at all hours. Furniture moved of its own accord, sliding across rooms with no explanation. Ordinary objects like vases and picture frames levitated and flew through the air whenever the boy was present. What started as typical poltergeist activity quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Scratches and markings began appearing on Roland's body in places he couldn't possibly reach. Words would manifest on his skin, carved by invisible claws. The boy's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent, displaying knowledge of things he had never learned and speaking in languages he had never heard. The Catholic Church eventually intervened, assigning a team of Jesuit priests to investigate and potentially perform an exorcism. According to detailed records kept by the attending clergy, a total of 48 people witnessed various aspects of the exorcism process, including 9 Jesuits who documented every supernatural occurrence they observed. During the ritual, the priests reported that Roland displayed superhuman strength, requiring multiple grown men to restrain his small frame. His voice changed completely, becoming deep and guttural as he spoke in ancient tongues. The temperature in the room would plummet without warning, and objects would fly across the space with tremendous force. Most disturbing of all, the entity speaking through Roland demonstrated intimate knowledge of the priests' personal lives, revealing secrets and private sins that no 14-year-old boy could possibly know. The exorcism sessions continued for weeks, with the demonic presence fighting viciously against every prayer and holy ritual. The entity identified itself through Roland's voice, claiming to be multiple demons working in concert to possess the boy's soul. It taunted the priests, blasphemed against God, and made horrific threats against anyone who tried to interfere with its plans. But the Roland Doe case reveals something crucial about how these entities operate. They don't simply appear randomly. They require invitation, whether through occult practices like Ouija boards, spiritual vulnerabilities, or psychological trauma. The demon that possessed Roland had been waiting, watching, and preparing long before it made its presence known. It studied the family, learned their weaknesses, and struck when they were most susceptible. Modern investigators have attempted to debunk the Roland Doe case, suggesting that a troubled teenager could have faked the supernatural phenomena. Skeptic Joe Nickell argues that there was no credible evidence of demonic possession, claiming that scratches and markings on the boy's body could have been self-inflicted. However, this explanation fails to account for the multiple witnesses, the documented supernatural strength, the knowledge of hidden information, and the dramatic physical manifestations that occurred in the presence of trained observers. Dr. Richard Gallagher, who has consulted on demonic possession cases for over 25 years, estimates that he has seen more cases of genuine possession than any other physician in the world. His professional opinion carries significant weight because he approaches each case from both medical and supernatural perspectives. He doesn't dismiss psychological explanations, but he also recognizes when phenomena exceed the boundaries of conventional medicine. The documentation from the Roland Doe case includes detailed written accounts, audio recordings, and testimony from multiple credible witnesses, including medical professionals, clergy members, and family members. This wealth of evidence makes it nearly impossible to dismiss the entire incident as mass hysteria or elaborate hoax. What makes this case particularly significant is how it demonstrates the progressive nature of demonic possession. The entity didn't immediately take full control of Roland. Instead, it followed a calculated pattern of escalation. First came the seemingly harmless Ouija board sessions, then minor paranormal disturbances that could be rationalized away. Gradually, the supernatural activity intensified until the demon had established such a strong foothold that complete possession became possible. This pattern appears consistently across documented possession cases worldwide. The demons are patient, methodical, and strategic in their approach. They understand human psychology and exploit our tendency to rationalize away supernatural experiences. By the time victims recognize the true nature of their situation, the entities have already gained considerable power and influence. The Roland Doe case also highlights the importance of spiritual intervention in combating demonic forces. The exorcism wasn't a quick fix or magical solution. It required weeks of intense spiritual warfare, with trained clergy members putting their own souls at risk to save the boy. The priests had to maintain absolute faith while facing direct attacks from supernatural entities that knew their deepest fears and weaknesses. Eventually, through persistent prayer, ritual, and unwavering faith, the exorcism succeeded. The demonic presence was forced to release its hold on Roland, who went on to live a normal life, marrying, having children, and working as an engineer until his death in 2020. He rarely spoke about his childhood ordeal, preferring to leave that dark chapter behind him. However, the lasting impact of the Roland Doe case extends far beyond one boy's terrifying experience. It provided concrete evidence that demonic entities are real, active, and dangerous. These forces operate with intelligence and purpose, targeting vulnerable individuals and families. They adapt their tactics to modern circumstances while maintaining the same fundamental goal: the corruption and destruction of human souls. The case files from Roland Doe's exorcism remain sealed in Vatican archives, containing details too disturbing for public release. Church officials who have reviewed these documents describe phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality itself. The supernatural events recorded during those weeks in 1949 continue to serve as a stark reminder that we live in a world where ancient evil still walks among us, seeking whom it may devour. Understanding cases like Roland Doe isn't about entertainment or sensationalism. It's about recognizing genuine spiritual dangers that threaten individuals and families across all cultures and time periods. These entities haven't disappeared or become less active. If anything, they've become more sophisticated in their methods, using modern technology, psychological manipulation, and cultural changes to gain access to new victims. Now we delve into some of the most bone-chilling encounters that have left investigators scratching their heads for decades. What makes these next cases particularly disturbing isn't just the supernatural events themselves, but the sheer number of credible witnesses who experienced them firsthand. Case number 10 takes us to Southend-on-Sea, England, where the Cage family encountered something that defied every natural law. In 1996, 12-year-old Matthew Cage began experiencing what his parents initially dismissed as typical teenage behavioral problems. However, when objects in their home started moving on their own, and Matthew began speaking in languages he'd never learned, the family realized they were dealing with something far beyond normal teenage rebellion. The Cage case gained international attention when paranormal investigators recorded Matthew levitating 3 feet off his bed while unconscious. Multiple cameras captured the event from different angles, making it impossible to dismiss as camera trickery or sleight of hand. During these episodes, Matthew would speak fluent Latin and ancient Greek, despite having no formal education in either language. When linguists analyzed the recordings, they discovered he was reciting passages from obscure medieval texts that hadn't been translated into English. What made this case particularly credible was the involvement of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a respected child psychologist who initially approached the case as a skeptic. After 6 months of observation, she documented over 40 instances of paranormal activity that she couldn't explain through conventional psychology or medical science. Matthew would accurately describe events happening in other rooms of the house while completely unconscious. And on one occasion, he provided detailed information about a neighbor's private family matter that later proved to be completely accurate. The entity possessing Matthew claimed to be a 13th century monk named Brother Aldrich, who had died during a plague outbreak. Historical research confirmed that a monk by that name had indeed lived in the area during the specified time period. The entity demonstrated knowledge of medieval monastery life that Matthew couldn't possibly have known, including specific Latin prayers used only in that particular religious order. Case number 11 brings us to the small town of Humboldt, Tennessee, where the Adams family farm became the site of one of America's most documented demonic infestations. In 2003, Robert and Linda Adams purchased a 200-acre farm that had been abandoned for over 30 years. Within weeks of moving in, they began experiencing phenomena that escalated from minor disturbances to violent attacks. The trouble started with their livestock. Healthy cattle would be found dead in the fields with no signs of disease or injury, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that couldn't be explained by natural causes. Veterinarians who examined the carcasses found no evidence of predator attacks or illness, yet the animals had died simultaneously, as if their life force had simply been drained away. Inside the farmhouse, the Adams family endured nightly torment. Doors would slam with such force that they splintered the wooden frames. The temperature in certain rooms would drop 40 degrees in seconds, causing frost to form on the windows even during summer months. Most disturbing were the voices that would echo through the house at night, speaking in what sounded like multiple languages, often growing so loud that neighbors a quarter-mile away could hear them. The case gained credibility when a team from the University of Memphis investigated the property using electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, and digital audio recording equipment. Their instruments registered massive electromagnetic anomalies that had no natural explanation, and thermal cameras captured dark figures moving through the house that were invisible to the naked eye. The audio recordings picked up voices speaking in ancient Aramaic, a language the Adams family had never encountered. Dr. James Harrison, a physics professor who participated in the investigation, later stated that the energy readings they recorded violated several known laws of physics. The electromagnetic fields were so intense that they interfered with electronic equipment from over 100 yards away, yet they seemed to be generated from within the house itself, with no identifiable source. Case number 12 takes us to the industrial city of Gary, Indiana, where the Ammons family encountered something so terrifying that it involved multiple government agencies and resulted in official police reports documenting supernatural activity. In 2011, LaToya Ammons moved into a rental house with her 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 12. Within months, all 4 family members were exhibiting signs of demonic possession. The children began walking backwards up walls in full view of family services workers and police officers. Medical professionals documented instances where the children would speak in deep adult voices while unconscious, often in languages they'd never heard. During one hospital visit, the 9-year-old boy was witnessed by multiple staff members walking backwards up a wall and across the ceiling while his eyes remained rolled back in his head. Gary Police Captain Charles Austin initially responded to the case as a domestic disturbance call, but quickly realized he was dealing with something beyond normal police work. In his official report, Austin documented witnessing doors opening and closing on their own, light bulbs exploding without electrical surges, and the children demonstrating knowledge about people and events they couldn't possibly have known. The case became even more credible when Department of Child Services personnel witnessed the paranormal activity firsthand. Valerie Washington, a family case manager, documented over 100 instances of supernatural phenomena during her visits to the home. She reported that the children would speak in unison while appearing to be unconscious, providing detailed information about deceased relatives they'd never met. Child Services removed the children from the home, but the phenomena followed them to their foster placements. Foster parents reported the same supernatural occurrences, leading authorities to realize that the possession was attached to the children rather than the house. This discovery contradicted the common belief that demonic infestations are location-specific. What made the Ammons case particularly significant was the involvement of Reverend Michael Maginot, who performed 3 separate exorcisms with the full cooperation of local authorities. Police officers and medical personnel remained present during the rituals, providing official documentation of the events. During the exorcisms, the children demonstrated supernatural strength, speaking in voices that forensic audio analysis confirmed were physically impossible for their vocal cords to produce. Case number 13 occurred in the remote mountains of West Virginia, where the Henderson family's weekend cabin became the site of encounters with entities that seemed to bridge the gap between demonic possession and cryptid sightings. In 2008, Mark and Janet Henderson purchased a secluded cabin in the Monongahela forest for weekend retreats. Their peaceful getaways quickly turned into nightmares when they began encountering creatures that defied conventional explanation. The Hendersons first noticed unusual sounds coming from the forest surrounding their cabin. These weren't typical wildlife noises, but rather what sounded like human voices speaking in whispers just beyond the range of understanding. When they investigated with flashlights, they would catch glimpses of tall humanoid figures standing among the trees, always just at the edge of their light's reach. The entities appeared to be roughly 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. What distinguished these beings from typical cryptid sightings was their apparent intelligence and their ability to interact with the physical environment in ways that suggested supernatural rather than merely unknown animal behavior. The creatures would arrange rocks and fallen branches in complex geometric patterns around the cabin, patterns that changed nightly with mathematical precision. Dr. Patricia Williams, an anthropologist from West Virginia University, investigated the site after the Hendersons reported their experiences. She documented the mysterious rock formations and noted that they resembled ritual circles used in ancient summoning ceremonies. Carbon dating of disturbed soil around these formations revealed no recent activity, yet the patterns appeared fresh each morning. The case took a darker turn when the entities began entering the cabin itself. The Hendersons would wake to find their belongings rearranged in specific patterns, often forming symbols that resembled ancient occult markings. Security cameras they installed captured dark figures moving through the rooms with unnatural fluid movements that seemed to defy gravity. Most disturbing were the psychological effects the entities had on anyone who encountered them. Visitors to the cabin would experience sudden onset depression, violent nightmares, and an overwhelming sense of dread that would persist for weeks after leaving the property. Several guests required psychological counseling after their visits, reporting dreams of being pulled into underground chambers where dozens of the creatures waited in darkness. Case number 14 brings us to the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, where the Martinez family discovered that some demonic encounters can be triggered by seemingly innocent objects. In 2015, Elena Martinez purchased an antique mirror at an estate sale, drawn to its ornate Victorian frame and surprisingly low price. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Crane, had insisted that Eleanor take the mirror for free, claiming she was eager to get rid of it. Within days of hanging the mirror in their master bedroom, the Martinez family began experiencing supernatural phenomena that centered around reflective surfaces throughout their home. Family members would catch glimpses of figures standing behind them in mirrors, figures that weren't visible when they turned around. The phenomena weren't limited to the antique mirror, but seemed to affect every reflective surface in the house, including windows, picture frames, and even the surface of water in drinking glasses. The activity escalated when their teenage daughter, Sophia, began having conversations with someone she claimed lived inside the mirrors. She would stand before various mirrors throughout the house, speaking in hushed tones to an invisible presence. When her parents questioned her about these conversations, Sophia insisted that she was talking to Mrs. Crane, the elderly woman who had given them the mirror. This revelation became deeply disturbing when Elena Martinez contacted the estate sale company and learned that Dorothy Crane had died 3 weeks before the sale. The woman who had insisted Eleanor take the mirror for free had been dead for almost a month at the time of their encounter. When Eleanor described the woman she'd met, the estate sale coordinator confirmed that the description perfectly matched Dorothy Crane. The mirror's influence on the family became increasingly malevolent. Family members began experiencing shared nightmares where they found themselves trapped inside reflective surfaces, unable to escape, while shadowy figures pressed against the glass from the outside. During these dreams, they could hear Dorothy Crane's voice, warning them that they belonged to the mirror now, just as she did. Paranormal investigator David Chen documented the case using full-spectrum cameras that could capture images beyond normal human vision. His photographs revealed multiple figures standing within the mirror's reflection, figures that weren't present in the room at the time the photos were taken. Thermal imaging showed significant temperature variations around all reflective surfaces in the house, with some areas registering temperatures over 20 degrees colder than the surrounding air. Case number 15 takes us to rural Louisiana, where the Broussard family encountered entities that seemed to emerge from the very swampland surrounding their property. In 2012, Jacques and Marie Broussard inherited a century-old plantation house deep in the Louisiana bayou. The property had been in Marie's family for generations, but had stood empty for over 30 years after her grandmother's death under mysterious circumstances. The Broussards moved into the house with their 2 young children, planning to restore the property to its former glory. However, they quickly discovered that the house harbored entities that had been contained within its walls for decades. The activity began with sounds of children playing in empty rooms, followed by the appearance of wet footprints that would appear throughout the house despite no visible water source. Local historian Dr. Evangeline Thibodeau researched the property's history and uncovered disturbing records dating back to the 1800s. The plantation had been the site of numerous unexplained deaths, particularly involving children who had supposedly drowned in the nearby bayou. However, the death records were inconsistent, with many children listed as drowning during drought years when the water levels were too low for accidental drowning to occur. The Broussard children began speaking about their new playmates, describing children who lived in the water beneath the house. The parents initially dismissed these claims as imagination until they discovered that their children were providing accurate names and descriptions of children who had died on the property over a century earlier. These historical children had never been documented in family records or local histories, yet courthouse records confirmed their existence and deaths. The entities became increasingly aggressive as the Broussards continued their restoration work. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Construction equipment would malfunction without explanation, and workers hired to help with renovations would quit after experiencing overwhelming feelings of dread and nausea while on the property. The case gained national attention when paranormal researcher Dr. Kenneth Mills documented evidence of intelligent water manipulation by the entities. Security cameras captured water flowing upward against gravity, forming temporary barriers in doorways and creating shapes that resembled human figures. Water would appear in sealed rooms and form patterns on walls that matched symbols found in 19th century voodoo practices. What made the Broussard case particularly significant was the discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the house's foundation. During renovation work, contractors uncovered a sealed room containing the remains of 7 children, along with evidence of ritual sacrifice. Forensic analysis confirmed that the children had died during the time periods mentioned in the death records, but their cause of death was inconsistent with drowning. The discovery suggested that the plantation had been the site of occult practices that had bound the children's spirits to the property. These cases represent just a fraction of the documented encounters that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Each incident involves multiple witnesses, official documentation, and evidence that has withstood decades of scrutiny and investigation. The entities in these cases demonstrate intelligence, purpose, and abilities that extend far beyond simple hauntings or psychological phenomena. What emerges from these accounts is a disturbing pattern of supernatural forces that seem to operate according to their own rules and agendas. They target specific individuals and families, often across generations, and demonstrate knowledge and abilities that suggest they exist outside our normal understanding of time and space. These aren't random encounters or misidentified natural phenomena, but deliberate interactions with forces that appear to be actively working to influence and control human lives. The consistency of these reports across different cultures, geographic locations, and time periods suggests that we're dealing with a genuine phenomenon that deserves serious scientific investigation rather than dismissal or ridicule. Moving into our next terrifying encounter, we travel to the desolate highways of rural America, where demonic entities have been known to manifest in the most unexpected places. This case demonstrates how malevolent forces don't confine themselves to haunted houses or ancient burial grounds. They can strike anywhere, anytime. Marcus Rodriguez was a long-haul trucker with over 15 years of experience driving the interstate highways that crisscross the American Southwest. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. Late-night drives through isolated stretches of desert, encounters with stranded motorists in the middle of nowhere, and the occasional wildlife crossing that could make your heart skip a beat. But nothing in his extensive driving career had prepared him for what he would encounter on Interstate 40, somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. It was 2 a.m. on a moonless October night when Marcus first noticed the hitchhiker. Standing beneath a flickering streetlight at a remote truck stop, the figure appeared to be a woman in her 30s, wearing a faded blue dress that seemed oddly out of place for the desert climate. What struck Marcus as unusual wasn't just her clothing, but her perfect stillness. She didn't move, didn't gesture for a ride, didn't even seem to acknowledge the few vehicles that passed by. She simply stood there, facing the road. Against his better judgment and company policy, Marcus pulled over. He'd picked up stranded travelers before, and something about this woman's vulnerability tugged at his conscience. As he approached, he called out to ask if she needed help. The woman turned toward him, and Marcus immediately felt a chill run down his spine. Her face was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light, and her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion of her eyes. Before Marcus could process what he was seeing, the woman spoke. Her voice was melodic, almost hypnotic. But there was something wrong with the way her lips moved. They seemed to be slightly out of sync with the words she was speaking. "I need to get to Phoenix," she said, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. Every instinct Marcus had developed over years of highway driving screamed at him to walk away, but he found himself unable to move. The woman's presence seemed to create a kind of mental fog, making it difficult for him to think clearly. Before he fully realized what was happening, he had agreed to take her as far as Phoenix, despite the fact that his route would take him nowhere near that city. The woman climbed into the passenger seat of his cab with movements that seemed too fluid, too graceful for a normal person. She settled in without fastening her seatbelt, which Marcus found odd, but he was too unsettled to mention it. As they pulled back onto the interstate, Marcus tried to make conversation, asking about her family and what had brought her to such a remote location. Her answers were vague and seemed to circle back on themselves without providing any real information. About 30 miles down the road, Marcus began to notice that the temperature in the cab was dropping rapidly. He checked the climate control, but it was set to normal. The cold seemed to be emanating from the passenger seat, and with each passing mile, it grew more intense. His breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the inside of the windows, despite the fact that the outside temperature was a comfortable 65 degrees. That's when Marcus made a crucial observation that would later convince investigators of the supernatural nature of his encounter. Looking in his side mirror, he could see his own reflection clearly, but where his passenger should have been visible, there was nothing. The seat appeared empty, even though he could see the woman sitting right next to him when he looked directly at her. The woman seemed to sense his growing unease and began to change. Her previously melodic voice became deeper, more guttural, and she started speaking in what sounded like multiple voices overlapping. The words were no longer English, but seemed to be some kind of ancient language that Marcus had never heard before. The temperature in the cab continued to plummet until Marcus could see his breath forming thick clouds in the air. Then the woman began to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle, but quickly escalated into a horrible, echoing cackle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus looked over and saw that her appearance was transforming. Her skin was becoming grey and mottled, her fingers were elongating into claw-like appendages, and those black eyes were now glowing with a faint red light. Panic finally broke through the mental fog that had been clouding Marcus's judgment. He slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, but when he turned to confront his passenger, she was gone. The cab was empty except for the lingering smell of sulfur and the rapidly normalizing temperature. The only evidence of her presence was a series of deep scratches in the passenger seat upholstery, scratches that formed a pattern resembling some kind of occult symbol. Marcus sat in his truck for over an hour trying to process what had happened. He called his dispatcher, but how do you explain to someone that you've just given a ride to what appeared to be a demon? Instead, he reported a mechanical issue and requested permission to return to the nearest truck stop to have his vehicle inspected. The investigation that followed revealed several disturbing facts. First, there was no record of any woman matching Marcus's description being reported missing in the area. Second, security cameras at the truck stop, where he claimed to have picked up the hitchhiker, showed Marcus pulling over and apparently talking to empty air before getting back in his truck. Most unsettling of all, the scratches in his passenger seat were analyzed by experts who confirmed they could not have been made by human fingernails or any conventional tool. But Marcus's encounter was not an isolated incident. Research into similar reports revealed a pattern of demonic hitchhiker encounters stretching back decades. These entities typically appear as stranded travelers, often women or children who somehow compel Good Samaritans to offer them assistance. Once inside a vehicle, they begin to reveal their true nature, subjecting their victims to psychological torment and sometimes physical manifestations. Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher who has studied roadside supernatural encounters, notes that these entities seem to feed on the kindness and compassion of their victims. They exploit the very human impulse to help others in distress, turning acts of charity into opportunities for demonic harassment. The highway setting is particularly effective because it isolates victims from potential help and creates a confined space where the entity can exert maximum psychological pressure. The scratches found in Marcus's truck were later compared to similar markings discovered in other vehicles involved in demonic hitchhiker encounters. The symbols consistently appeared to be variations of ancient binding or summoning marks, suggesting that these entities may be attempting to create some kind of spiritual connection with their victims or the vehicles themselves. Marcus never fully recovered from his encounter. He reported ongoing nightmares featuring the woman from the highway, and fellow truckers noted that he became increasingly paranoid about picking up hitchhikers. His logbooks from the months following the incident show that he began taking longer routes to avoid the stretch of highway where the encounter occurred, and he eventually left long-haul trucking altogether. The demonic hitchhiker phenomenon represents a particularly insidious form of supernatural encounter because it preys on human decency. These entities don't wait for victims to seek them out or stumble into haunted locations. They actively hunt for compassionate individuals who are willing to help strangers in need. This predatory behavior suggests a level of intelligence and planning that goes beyond simple haunting or possession. What makes these encounters especially terrifying is their mobile nature. Unlike traditional hauntings that are tied to specific locations, demonic hitchhikers can appear anywhere along the vast network of highways that connect our communities. They transform the very roads we depend on for commerce and connection into hunting grounds for malevolent entities. The psychological impact on victims extends far beyond the initial encounter. Many report developing a deep mistrust of strangers and an inability to engage in acts of random kindness without experiencing overwhelming anxiety. This corruption of natural human compassion may be one of the most damaging aspects of these encounters, as it fundamentally alters how victims interact with the world around them. Marcus's case also highlights the challenge of documenting and investigating mobile supernatural encounters. Unlike haunted buildings or specific locations where multiple witnesses can corroborate paranormal activity, highway encounters typically involve single witnesses whose testimony is difficult to verify. This isolation makes victims more vulnerable to skepticism and disbelief, compounding the trauma of their experience. The physical evidence in Marcus's case, the unexplained scratches and the security footage showing him apparently interacting with an invisible entity, provides rare documentation of these encounters. However, such evidence is often dismissed or explained away by skeptics who argue that stress and sleep deprivation, common among long-haul drivers, could account for hallucinations and self-inflicted damage. Yet the consistency of reports across different geographic regions and time periods suggests something more than shared delusions or urban legends. The specific details, the appearance of stranded women, The gradual revelation of demonic characteristics, the extreme temperature changes, and the mysterious symbols appear in accounts from drivers who had no contact with each other and no prior knowledge of similar encounters. The Interstate 40 corridor where Marcus's encounter occurred has become something of a hotspot for supernatural activity. Local law enforcement agencies have noted an unusual number of reports involving abandoned vehicles, mysterious accidents, and drivers found in states of severe psychological distress, with no clear explanation for their condition. While most of these incidents are officially attributed to fatigue, medical emergencies, or substance abuse, the pattern suggests something more sinister may be at work. The demonic hitchhiker phenomenon also raises questions about the relationship between modern transportation infrastructure and supernatural activity. Some researchers theorize that the vast network of highways, built with such speed and efficiency over the past century, may have disrupted ancient spiritual boundaries or created new pathways for malevolent entities to move through the landscape. Marcus's encounter serves as a stark reminder that evil can manifest anywhere, even in the most mundane circumstances. The simple act of offering help to a stranger, one of humanity's most noble impulses, becomes a doorway for demonic intrusion. This perversion of human kindness represents one of the most chilling aspects of supernatural evil: its ability to corrupt and exploit our best intentions. For those who travel America's highways, Marcus's story offers both a warning and a lesson. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't immediately identify why. The entities that masquerade as helpless travelers are patient and skilled at manipulation, but they cannot completely suppress the primal fear response that recognizes genuine supernatural threat. The aftermath of Marcus's encounter demonstrates the long-lasting impact of demonic harassment. Years later, he still struggles with the memory of that night, and his experience has fundamentally changed how he views the world. We've covered 22 encounters so far, and each one reveals something disturbing about the nature of demonic activity. But what happens when these forces don't just visit occasionally? What happens when they decide to make themselves at home? The Martinez family thought they'd found their dream house in rural New Mexico. A sprawling adobe home with mountain views, surrounded by sagebrush and silence. What they didn't know was that the previous owner had spent years experimenting with ceremonial magic in the basement. The concrete floor was etched with symbols that had been painted over but never properly cleansed. Maria Martinez was the first to notice the changes. Her 3-year-old daughter Isabella started having conversations with someone named Miguel who lived in the walls. At first, Maria assumed it was a typical imaginary friend. Children often create companions when adjusting to new environments, but Isabella's descriptions were unnervingly specific. Miguel had burns on his face. He was angry because his family had left him behind. He wanted Isabella to come play with him in the dark places where grown-ups couldn't find them. The physical manifestations started small. Doors slamming when no one was near them. The temperature in certain rooms dropping 20 degrees without explanation. Electronics malfunctioning in patterns that defied logic. The television would turn itself on at 3 in the morning, always tuned to static-filled channels that shouldn't exist. But the entity wasn't content with subtle harassment. It began targeting the family's faith directly. Crucifixes would be found turned upside down each morning. Holy water that Maria kept in small bottles throughout the house would turn black overnight. The family Bible, a treasured heirloom passed down through 4 generations, was discovered torn to shreds in the middle of the living room floor. Dr. Eduardo Ramirez, a psychiatrist who specializes in cases involving alleged supernatural phenomena, has documented over 300 similar incidents throughout the southwestern United States. He notes that demonic entities often display what he calls escalation patterns. They begin with psychological warfare, testing the family's resolve and faith. When that proves insufficient, they move to physical intimidation. The Martinez case followed this pattern precisely. After weeks of minor disturbances, the entity began manifesting physically. Maria's husband, Carlos, saw it first. A tall figure with charred skin standing at the foot of their bed at 2 in the morning. When he reached for the lamp, the figure spoke in a voice like grinding glass, telling him that his family belonged to it now. The attacks on Isabella became more direct. She would be found sleepwalking toward dangerous areas of the house, always claiming that Miguel was showing her secret passages. Scratches appeared on her arms, forming patterns that resembled the symbols hidden beneath the basement floor. Most disturbing of all, she began speaking in Spanish dialects that predated European colonization, languages she had never been exposed to. What makes the Martinez case particularly significant is the documentation. Carlos, a professional photographer, began recording everything. The footage he captured defies conventional explanation. Objects moving without human contact, doors opening and closing in impossible sequences. And on one unforgettable night, a clear recording of Isabella's voice layered with the deep, resonant tones of something decidedly not human. The family contacted Father Miguel Santos, an elderly priest with extensive experience in exorcism cases. Father Santos had worked with the Vatican's official exorcist training program and had conducted over 50 successful cleansing rituals throughout his career. When he arrived at the Martinez home, he immediately sensed what he described as an overwhelming presence of malevolence. The formal exorcism took place over 3 consecutive nights. The recordings from these sessions, authenticated by multiple audio experts, capture phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality. Voices speaking in languages that linguists have identified as corrupted forms of ancient Aramaic and pre-Columbian dialects. Sounds of objects being thrown with tremendous force, despite the room being empty except for the family and the priest. On the second night, the entity attempted to possess Isabella directly. The child's voice changed completely, becoming deep and guttural. She spoke of events that had occurred in the house decades before her birth, describing in precise detail the occult rituals that had been performed in the basement. She knew the names of people who had participated in these ceremonies, information that was later verified through historical records. Father Santos reported that the entity claimed to be not one demon, but a collective of spirits that had been summoned and bound to the property through blood sacrifice. It spoke of a ritual that had gone wrong, trapping multiple entities in the physical realm. These spirits had been waiting for a family with young children to move into the house, as children's spiritual defenses are naturally weaker. The breakthrough came on the third night when Father Santos discovered the painted-over symbols in the basement. Using consecrated salt and holy oil, he began the process of breaking the binding circles that had been carved into the concrete. As each symbol was cleansed, the supernatural activity in the house decreased dramatically. But the entity didn't surrender without a final assault. As Father Santos completed the cleansing ritual, every piece of glass in the house shattered simultaneously. The walls themselves seemed to shake with rage. Isabella was thrown from her bed with such force that she left an impression in the drywall. For 15 minutes, the house was filled with the sound of screaming that seemed to come from the very foundations. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the house for months lifted completely. Isabella's personality returned to normal overnight. The unexplained temperature drops ceased. The electronic malfunctions ended. The Martinez family finally had their home back. The case took an unexpected turn 6 months later when construction workers renovating the basement discovered human remains buried beneath the concrete floor. Forensic analysis revealed the bones belonged to a young man who had died approximately 30 years earlier. Cause of death was determined to be ritual murder, with evidence of ceremonial knife wounds that matched patterns found in documented cases of occult sacrifice. Police investigation revealed that the previous owner, a man named David Crowley, had been part of an underground group that practiced what they called chaos magic. According to surviving members who were eventually located and interviewed, Crowley had become obsessed with summoning and binding demonic entities for personal power. The group had conducted multiple rituals in the basement, culminating in a human sacrifice that had gone catastrophically wrong. What makes this case particularly chilling is the revelation that Crowley had not acted alone. The group had included a local judge, 2 prominent businessmen, and a university professor. All had participated in rituals designed to invoke demonic assistance in their professional lives. When the final ritual resulted in death, the group disbanded, but the spiritual consequences of their actions remained bound to the property. The Martinez case demonstrates several key characteristics of demonic infestation. First, these entities are often connected to specific locations where occult activity has taken place. Second, they show particular interest in families with young children, whom they perceive as easier targets for influence and possession. Third, they display intelligence and patience, often spending weeks or months studying their victims before launching full-scale attacks. Dr. Ramirez notes that successful resolution of these cases requires both spiritual intervention and practical action. The exorcism performed by Father Santos was essential, but equally important was the discovery and proper cleansing of the physical anchors that bound the entities to the location. Without addressing both the spiritual and material aspects of the infestation, the problem would likely have returned. The Martinez family eventually sold the house and moved to a different state. The new owners, fully informed about the property's history, had it blessed by multiple religious traditions before moving in. To date, there have been no reports of supernatural activity at the location. However, the case raises disturbing questions about how many other properties might harbor similar spiritual contamination. Real estate disclosure laws don't require sellers to reveal histories of occult activity or alleged hauntings. Families could unknowingly move into homes where previous owners have created supernatural problems that persist long after the original practitioners are gone. Father Santos, now in his 70s, continues his work with families experiencing demonic harassment. He estimates that he receives at least 50 requests for help each year, with the numbers increasing steadily. He attributes this rise to what he calls spiritual warfare becoming more intense as traditional religious practice declines and interest in occult practices grows. The documentation from the Martinez case has become part of the Vatican's official archives on demonic activity. The recordings and photographs provide some of the clearest evidence ever captured of supernatural phenomena occurring in a domestic setting. Skeptics have attempted to debunk the evidence, but no natural explanations have been found for the documented occurrences. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrates that demonic entities are not limited to ancient locations or historic buildings. They can establish footholds in modern suburban homes when the conditions are right. The combination of occult activity and violent death created a spiritual environment that attracted and sustained malevolent forces for decades. The Martinez family's ordeal serves as a warning about the lasting consequences of dabbling in dark spiritual practices. What began as a group of adults seeking power and knowledge through forbidden rituals created a legacy of terror that endangered innocent children years later. The spiritual realm operates by different rules than the physical world, and the effects of supernatural activity can persist far longer than anyone anticipates. These cases continue to accumulate, each one adding to our understanding of how demonic forces operate in the modern world. They adapt to contemporary settings while maintaining the same fundamental patterns of harassment, intimidation, and attempted possession that have characterized such encounters throughout history. Continuing our exploration of history's most terrifying demonic encounters, we arrive at cases that challenge everything we think we know about the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. These next accounts come from multiple continents and span decades, yet they share disturbing similarities that suggest these entities operate according to their own twisted logic. In the summer of 1994, a family in rural Montana encountered something that defied all rational explanation. The Hendersons had recently moved into an old farmhouse, drawn by the property's isolation and the promise of a fresh start. What they found instead was a nightmare that would haunt them for years to come. It began with their livestock. Cattle were found dead in the pasture, not killed by predators or disease, but drained completely of blood with no visible wounds. Their German shepherd, Rex, refused to enter certain areas of the property, whimpering and backing away from what appeared to be empty space. The first direct encounter occurred when 16-year-old Sarah Henderson was alone in the barn feeding the remaining animals. She described a presence that felt like ice water flooding her veins, followed by the overwhelming stench of sulfur and rotting meat. The barn doors slammed shut on their own, trapping her inside with something that began speaking in a voice that wasn't quite human. It knew intimate details about her life, her fears, her secrets. The entity tormented her for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed when her father found her collapsed on the barn floor, scratching at invisible attackers. What makes the Henderson case particularly chilling is the physical evidence. Veterinarians who examined the dead cattle found no explanation for their condition. The blood hadn't simply drained away, it had vanished entirely, leaving the animals mummified in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Temperature readings taken throughout the property showed inexplicable cold spots that moved and shifted, sometimes dropping 40 degrees in seconds. Most disturbing were the recordings captured on the family's security system, audio that picked up voices speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, conversations that seemed to be planning something terrible. The harassment escalated over months. Objects would fly across rooms with no one present. The family's youngest son, 8-year-old Michael, began speaking to invisible companions who knew things about deceased relatives that he couldn't possibly have known. Photos developed from the property showed dark figures standing in windows of empty rooms, shadows that cast reflections when no one was there to cast them. The local Catholic priest, who attempted to bless the property, fled after witnessing what he described as manifestations of pure evil that challenged his faith to its core. The Hendersons finally abandoned their home in the winter of 1995, but the entity followed them. For 3 years, wherever they moved, the supernatural activity continued. Sarah suffered mysterious injuries, waking with scratches and bruises she couldn't explain. Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic, and he began drawing disturbing images of horned figures that he claimed visited him in his dreams. It wasn't until the family underwent an intensive cleansing ritual performed by a Native American shaman that the activity finally ceased, but the psychological scars remained. Moving across the globe to Japan, we encounter the case of the Yamamoto family in Kyoto, documented extensively by paranormal researchers in 1987. The family's traditional home, built on land that had once been a battlefield, became the center of activity that combined elements of Japanese folklore with phenomena that transcended cultural boundaries. The patriarch, Hiroshi Yamamoto, was a respected businessman who had never believed in the supernatural until his family became targets of something that defied explanation. The activity began with their daughter Yuki, age 12, who started exhibiting behaviors that alarmed her parents. She would speak in perfect ancient Japanese dialects she had never learned, recounting historical events with accuracy that scholars later verified. But more disturbing were the times she would speak in what appeared to be multiple voices simultaneously, conversations between entities that seemed to be using her as a conduit. During these episodes, her physical strength increased dramatically. It took 3 adults to restrain her when the episodes turned violent. Dr. Kenji Nakamura, a psychiatrist who studied the case, documented instances where Yuki demonstrated knowledge that was impossible for her to possess. She described in vivid detail the layout of buildings that had been destroyed centuries before her birth, spoke about people who had died long before she was born, as if she had known them personally. Blood tests during her episodes showed chemical changes that medical science couldn't explain, hormone levels that should have been fatal, yet she showed no signs of distress. The family's home became a focal point for increasingly bizarre phenomena. Neighbors reported seeing figures in samurai armor walking through the Yamamoto property at night, sometimes engaged in what appeared to be battles that left no physical trace by morning. Temperature fluctuations were so extreme that frost would form on interior walls during summer heat waves. Electronic devices would malfunction in specific patterns, creating sounds that resembled voices speaking in ancient Japanese. What set the Yamamoto case apart was the cultural context. Japanese folklore speaks of entities called oni, demons that torment humans, but the activity in their home went beyond traditional beliefs. Western paranormal investigators who studied the case found similarities to demonic possession cases from completely different cultural backgrounds, suggesting that whatever was affecting the family transcended local mythology and tapped into something more universal and sinister. The resolution came through a combination of traditional Shinto purification rituals and modern exorcism techniques. Multiple religious leaders from different faiths worked together over several months to cleanse the property and free Yuki from whatever had taken hold of her. The collaboration between Buddhist monks, Shinto priests, and Christian clergy created a unique approach that seemed to address the multicultural nature of the manifestation. Perhaps one of the most documented and disturbing cases comes from a small town in Eastern Europe, where an entire family was terrorized by entities that seemed to feed off their fear and desperation. The Kozlowski family in rural Poland experienced activity that began in 2003 and continued for nearly 2 years, documented by local authorities, medical professionals, and paranormal researchers from across Europe. Jan Kozlowski, a factory worker, first noticed something was wrong when his wife Anna began having nightmares so vivid and terrifying that she would wake up with physical injuries. Scratches, bruises, and bite marks would appear on her body during sleep, wounds that medical examination showed couldn't have been self-inflicted. Their 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 14, began reporting visits from a tall man in black who would stand at the foot of their beds, watching them with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. The psychological warfare was methodical and cruel. The entity would manipulate household items to create fear, turning family photos face down, rearranging furniture in impossible configurations, leaving messages written in an archaic form of Latin that scholars identified as being used primarily in medieval demonology texts. What made this case particularly credible was the involvement of local law enforcement. Officers responding to disturbance calls witnessed phenomena they couldn't explain or dismiss. One policeman's report describes watching kitchen knives embed themselves in the ceiling while the family cowered in terror, the blades driven so deep into the wooden beams that they couldn't be removed without power tools. Another officer reported seeing a figure in one of the bedrooms that cast no reflection in mirrors, a presence that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The medical documentation is equally compelling. Anna Kozlowski was examined by multiple doctors who confirmed that her injuries were consistent with attacks by something with unusual strength and apparent malevolence. The patterns of wounds suggested an intelligence behind the attacks, targeting areas that would cause maximum pain and psychological trauma without causing death. The children showed signs of severe psychological stress, but also exhibited knowledge and behaviors that suggested influence from an external source. Religious intervention proved initially ineffective. Local Catholic priests attempted traditional exorcism rituals, but the entity seemed to grow stronger with each attempt, as if feeding off the spiritual energy of the confrontation. It wasn't until a team of demonologists from Rome arrived with more ancient and powerful rites that progress was made. The final exorcism required 3 priests working in shifts over the course of a week, during which time the family had to be relocated for their safety. The audio recordings from these sessions, later released with the family's permission, capture sounds that defy explanation. Voices speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, inhuman screams that caused physical pain to anyone listening, and conversations between multiple entities discussing their plans for the family in terms that suggested a level of organization and intelligence that challenged assumptions about the nature of demonic manifestation. These cases represent just a fraction of the documented encounters that continue to occur worldwide. What makes them particularly significant is not just their individual horror, but the patterns they reveal. These entities demonstrate intelligence, patience, and the understanding of human psychology that allows them to exploit our deepest fears and vulnerabilities. They adapt their methods to the cultural context of their victims, suggesting either a sophisticated understanding of human societies or a network of malevolent forces that share information across geographical and temporal boundaries. The physical evidence from these cases, combined with testimony from credible witnesses, including law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and religious authorities, creates a body of documentation that challenges skeptical dismissal. We're not dealing with isolated incidents of hysteria or fraud, but with a phenomenon that appears to be both ancient and ongoing, a force that operates according to its own rules and serves its own incomprehensible purposes. What's perhaps most disturbing is the escalation we see in modern cases. As our world becomes more connected and our spiritual defenses weaker, these entities seem to be growing bolder, their manifestations more frequent and more violent. The tools of modern technology that were once thought to provide protection instead seem to offer new avenues for harassment, with electronic devices being manipulated to deliver threatening messages and digital recordings capturing phenomena that shouldn't exist. The implications are staggering. If these accounts are accurate and the evidence suggests they are, then we're sharing our world with intelligences that view humanity not as equals or even as enemies, but as prey. They study us, learn our weaknesses, and strike when we're most vulnerable. They're patient, methodical, and utterly without mercy. The 22nd encounter brings us to what many consider the most documented case of demonic oppression in modern history. In 1976, Anneliese Michel, a young German woman, underwent 67 Catholic exorcism rites, each one meticulously recorded on audio tape. What makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the brutal nature of her possession, but the fact that every terrifying moment was captured for posterity. Anneliese's ordeal began in her teens with epileptic seizures and psychiatric treatment that proved completely ineffective. By age 20, she had become intolerant of religious objects and began hearing voices that would command her to perform increasingly disturbing acts. During the exorcisms, 6 demons allegedly revealed themselves through her, claiming to be Lucifer, Judas, Cain, and even Hitler himself. Her voice would transform into something deep and guttural, speaking in languages she had never learned, while displaying superhuman strength that required multiple adults to restrain her. The audio recordings from these sessions reveal something that defies medical explanation. Anneliese would speak in perfect Latin for hours, providing historical details about biblical figures that no young German woman should have known. She would bark like a dog, hiss like a serpent, and laugh with a voice that witnesses described as coming from the depths of hell itself. The demons would engage in theological debates with the priests, demonstrating knowledge of church doctrine that surpassed even seasoned clergy. What's particularly disturbing is how the entities seemed to know intimate details about everyone present during the exorcisms. They would reveal secret sins, childhood traumas, and hidden fears of the priests and family members, information that Anneliese could never have possessed through normal means. The demons would taunt the exorcists with their powerlessness, predicting exactly how long the rituals would continue and what suffering they would inflict. As the months progressed, Anneliese's physical deterioration became horrific. She would eat insects and drink her own urine, actions that the demons claimed brought them pleasure. She would bang her head against walls with such force that the sound could be heard throughout the house. The entities forced her to perform over 600 genuflections in a single day, causing her knees to rupture and bleed. She would sleep on cold stone floors, refuse food for days, and engage in self-mutilation that left permanent scars across her body. The 23rd case takes us to the infamous Enfield poltergeist, where an ordinary London council house became the epicenter of phenomena that defied every attempt at rational explanation. For over 2 years, the Hodgson family endured an assault from forces that seemed determined to drive them from their home through sheer terror and physical violence. The activity centered on 11-year-old Janet Hodgson, who would levitate in front of multiple witnesses, her body contorting in ways that violated basic human anatomy. Investigators from the Society for Psychical Research documented her being thrown across rooms by invisible hands, her voice changing to that of an elderly man named Bill Wilkins, who had died in the house years earlier. When speaking as Bill, Janet would provide details about his life, his death, and the layout of the house as it existed decades before the Hodgsons moved in. The entity's knowledge was unnaturally comprehensive. It knew the names of neighbors from 40 years past, could describe furniture that had been removed before the Hodgsons arrived, and would reference local events that had occurred long before Janet was born. When skeptical investigators attempted to catch Janet faking the phenomena, the entity would become violent, hurling heavy furniture across rooms and causing the temperature to plummet by 30 degrees in seconds. What made the Enfield case particularly credible was the sheer number of witnesses. Police officers, social workers, journalists, and neighbors all observed the same impossible events. Objects would fly through the air in full view of multiple people, following trajectories that defied gravity. Heavy armchairs would slide across floors by themselves, while matches would ignite spontaneously in people's hands. The phenomena occurred in broad daylight, in crowded rooms, under controlled conditions that eliminated any possibility of trickery. The entity demonstrated an intelligence that was both cunning and malevolent. It would wait for the most skeptical observers to arrive before performing the most dramatic manifestations, as if it took pleasure in converting non-believers. When recording equipment was brought in, the voice would become clearer and more articulate. providing investigators with hours of material that acoustic experts confirmed could not have been produced by Janet's vocal cords. Our 24th encounter involves the Bell Witch of Tennessee, a case so well documented that it remains the only supernatural event officially recognized by a state government as causing a human death. The entity that terrorized the Bell family from 1817 to 1821 displayed capabilities that went far beyond typical haunting activity. The Bell Witch, as it came to be known, possessed an intelligence that seemed to transcend normal human understanding. It could be in multiple locations simultaneously, conversing with family members in different rooms, while also appearing to neighbors miles away. The entity would predict future events with perfect accuracy, describing visitors who would arrive days later and detailing conversations that had not yet occurred. What set this case apart was the entity's intimate knowledge of everyone it encountered. It knew the private thoughts of family members, could recite conversations that had taken place in distant locations, and would reveal secrets that people had never shared with anyone. The creature seemed to have access to information from across vast distances and different time periods, suggesting an awareness that operated outside normal physical limitations. The entity's physical manifestations were equally extraordinary. It could make objects appear and disappear at will, transport items across impossible distances, and manipulate matter in ways that violated known physics. Witnesses reported seeing the family's quilts pulled off beds by invisible hands, dishes flying through the air in perfect formation, and food disappearing from sealed containers while people watched. Most disturbing was the entity's apparent ability to influence people's health and mental state. Family members would suddenly develop mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't diagnose, only to recover completely when the entity decided to withdraw its influence. The creature seemed to feed on fear and confusion, growing stronger as its victims became more distressed. The 25th case brings us to a modern encounter that demonstrates how demonic entities have adapted to contemporary technology. In 2019, the Morrison family of Portland, Oregon, experienced phenomena that incorporated electronic devices in ways that suggested an intelligence capable of manipulating digital systems. The activity began with their smart home devices activating randomly throughout the night. Security cameras would turn to focus on empty corners. Thermostats would adjust themselves to create freezing conditions in specific rooms, and voice assistants would begin speaking in languages that weren't programmed into their systems. What made this particularly unsettling was the precision of the manipulation. The entity seemed to understand exactly how each device functioned and could control them in ways that even the manufacturers couldn't explain. The family's teenage daughter, Sarah, became the primary target of the entity's attention. Her smartphone would display messages in ancient Hebrew and Latin, languages she had never studied. The texts would appear in her photo gallery, replacing family pictures with disturbing images that seemed to move when viewed directly. Her social media accounts would post content in the middle of the night, sharing personal information and photos that had never been uploaded to any platform. More disturbing was the entity's ability to manipulate video calls and streaming services. During family video chats with relatives, a dark figure would appear in the background of their feed, visible to the people they were calling, but not present in the actual room. The entity would interrupt Netflix streams to insert footage that appeared to be filmed inside their own house, showing rooms from angles that shouldn't have been possible and capturing conversations that had occurred in private. The Morrison case reveals how demonic entities have evolved to exploit our dependence on technology. The creature demonstrated an understanding of network protocols, encryption methods, and digital storage that surpassed most IT professionals. It could access cloud storage accounts, manipulate GPS data to show family members in locations they had never visited, and somehow influence the algorithms of social media platforms to ensure disturbing content would appear in their feeds. The 26th encounter occurred in a maximum security prison in Louisiana, where correctional officers documented phenomena that turned an already dangerous environment into something approaching hell on Earth. The entity that manifested in Cell Block D seemed to feed on the violence and despair that permeated the facility, growing stronger with each act of brutality it witnessed. Inmates reported being visited by a figure that would appear in locked cells, passing through solid steel as if it were made of air. The entity would whisper detailed information about the crimes that had landed the prisoners in that facility, describing scenes that had never been made public, and knowing details that only the perpetrators could have known. It would torment the inmates with visions of their victims, forcing them to relive their worst moments with perfect clarity. What made this case particularly credible was the corroboration from multiple correctional officers. Guards reported seeing the same dark figure moving through the cell block, watching from the corners as violence erupted between inmates. Security cameras would malfunction whenever the entity appeared, but the audio systems would continue recording voices speaking in ancient languages and making threats in perfect English. The entity seemed to have the ability to influence the inmates' behavior, turning minor disputes into deadly confrontations. Prisoners who had shown no previous signs of mental illness would suddenly become violent, claiming they were following orders from a voice that promised them power and protection. The facility's suicide rate tripled during the period of activity, with inmates leaving notes describing visions of eternal torment that awaited them. Most disturbing was the entity's apparent knowledge of the prison's security systems. It could predict exactly when guards would make their rounds, knew which cells would be searched on specific days, and seemed to orchestrate events to maximize chaos and suffering. The creature appeared to understand human psychology with frightening precision, knowing exactly how to manipulate both inmates and staff to create the conditions it desired. Our 27th case demonstrates the global nature of demonic activity through an encounter that occurred in a remote village in the Himalayas. Western anthropologists studying local customs encountered phenomena that challenged their understanding of both science and spirituality. The research team, led by Dr. Sarah Chen from Berkeley, was documenting traditional Buddhist practices when they witnessed a possession that lasted for 6 continuous days. The victim, a young monk named Tenzin, began speaking in perfect English despite having no exposure to Western languages. The entity claimed to be a demon that had been bound to the mountain for over 1,000 years, and its knowledge of historical events proved unnaturally comprehensive. What made this case remarkable was the entity's ability to discuss quantum physics, molecular biology, and advanced mathematics with accuracy that impressed the academic researchers. It would engage in complex philosophical debates about consciousness and reality, demonstrating an understanding of Western science that no isolated mountain monk could have possessed. The creature seemed to have access to humanity's entire accumulated knowledge, discussing discoveries that had been made in laboratories thousands of miles away. The local lamas confirmed that similar possessions had occurred throughout their recorded history, always involving entities that claimed to be ancient beings with vast knowledge of human affairs. The possessed individuals would speak in languages that predated written history, describing events and civilizations that had been lost to time. The consistency of these accounts across centuries suggested that the same entities were repeatedly manifesting in different hosts. The 28th encounter brings us back to American soil, where a family in rural Montana experienced phenomena that seemed designed to drive them to madness through psychological torture. The Hartwell family's ordeal began after they moved into a farmhouse that had been abandoned for over 50 years. The entity that inhabited their new home demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. Rather than relying on dramatic physical manifestations, it employed subtle manipulations that made the family question their own sanity. Personal items would be moved to locations where family members would swear they had never placed them. Photographs would be altered to show people who had never been present when the pictures were taken. The creature seemed to study each family member's fears and vulnerabilities, then exploit them with surgical precision. The father, who had served in Afghanistan, would hear the sounds of incoming mortars and the screams of wounded soldiers. The mother, who had lost a child in infancy, would find baby clothes appearing in her closet and hear crying from empty rooms. The teenage children would experience nightmares so vivid and consistent that they began to wonder if they were actually memories of events that had never occurred. What made the Hartwell case particularly insidious was the entity's ability to isolate family members from each other. It would orchestrate arguments over incidents that no one could remember clearly, creating doubt and suspicion where there had once been trust. The family began to fracture as each member became convinced that the others were somehow responsible for the increasingly bizarre events. The entity's psychological manipulation extended to their relationship with the outside world. Neighbors would report having conversations with family members that the family had no memory of. Phone calls would be made from their house to local businesses, placing orders and making appointments that no one in the family had authorized. The creature seemed determined to destroy not just their peace of mind, but their entire social structure. Our 29th case occurred in a children's hospital in Chicago, where staff members documented phenomena that seemed to target the most vulnerable patients. The entity that manifested in the pediatric ward displayed a cruelty that defied comprehension, focusing its attention on children who were already fighting for their lives. Nurses reported seeing a dark figure moving through the ward at night, stopping at the bedsides of critically ill children. Patients who encountered the entity would suddenly take turns for the worse, developing complications that their doctors couldn't explain. Children who had been recovering would relapse mysteriously, while others would wake up screaming about nightmares that all followed the same terrifying pattern. The entity seemed to feed on innocence and suffering, growing stronger as it tormented its youngest victims. Children would report being visited by a shadow man who would whisper terrible things about their families and their futures. The creature would tell them that their parents didn't really love them, that they were going to die alone and forgotten, and that no one would remember them after they were gone. What made this case particularly heartbreaking was the entity's ability to manipulate the children's medical equipment. Monitors would show false readings, IV drips would stop flowing, and ventilators would malfunction at critical moments. The creature seemed to understand exactly how to exploit the technology that was keeping these children alive, using their life support systems as instruments of terror. The hospital's staff found themselves dealing with phenomena that challenged their scientific training. Medications would change composition while sitting in locked cabinets. Surgical instruments would disappear during critical procedures, and computer systems would display patient information that had never been entered into the database. The entity appeared to have access to medical knowledge that surpassed even the specialists treating these children. The 30th encounter takes us to a lighthouse off the coast of Maine, where the isolation amplified the terror experienced by the maintenance crew. The entity that inhabited this remote outpost seemed to draw power from the endless expanse of dark ocean that surrounded the structure. Lighthouse keeper James Morrison and his assistant reported phenomena that intensified during severe storms, as if the entity fed on the chaos of nature itself. The lighthouse beam would change color without any mechanical explanation, casting an unnatural red glow across the waters that seemed to attract things from the depths. Ships passing in the distance would report seeing figures standing on the lighthouse gallery, even when Morrison and his assistant were both inside the structure. The entity demonstrated an intimate knowledge of maritime disasters that had occurred in those waters over the past century. It would describe the final moments of sailors who had drowned during storms, providing details that had never been recorded in any official reports. The creature seemed to have witnessed every tragedy that had occurred in that stretch of ocean, collecting the memories of the dying and using them to torment the living. Most disturbing were the radio transmissions that would emanate from the lighthouse's emergency equipment. Coast Guard stations would receive distress calls in the voices of sailors who had died decades earlier, pleading for rescue from waters where no ships were present. The transmissions would include accurate coordinates for locations where vessels had been lost, but when rescue teams investigated, they would find only empty ocean. Our 31st case brings us to a university research facility where scientists studying consciousness encountered an entity that seemed to exist at the intersection of matter and mind. The phenomena began during experiments involving advanced brain imaging technology, as if the research itself had opened a doorway to something that should have remained hidden. Dr. Michael Ross and his team were conducting studies on near-death experiences when their equipment began detecting neural activity in subjects who showed no signs of brain function. The patterns were unlike anything in medical literature, displaying a complexity that suggested consciousness far beyond normal human capability. When they attempted to analyze the data, they discovered that the patterns contained information encoded in ways that seemed to transcend the physical structure of the brain. The entity that emerged from these experiments demonstrated abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness. It could influence the thoughts and perceptions of research subjects from outside the laboratory, communicating through dreams and visions that occurred miles away from the facility. Subjects would report receiving detailed scientific information that they had never studied, providing accurate data about experiments they had never witnessed. What made this case particularly significant was the entity's apparent understanding of quantum mechanics and consciousness research. It would engage the scientists in discussions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the relationship between mind and matter. The creature seemed to possess knowledge about the fundamental structure of the universe that surpassed current human understanding. The 32nd encounter occurred in a military base in Nevada, where personnel encountered phenomena that suggested demonic entities were capable of infiltrating the most secure facilities on Earth. The manifestations began in an underground bunker that housed classified research projects, as if the entity was drawn to humanity's most advanced and dangerous technologies. Security footage captured images of a figure that seemed to phase through reinforced concrete walls, moving through the facility without triggering any of the sophisticated detection systems. The entity demonstrated detailed knowledge of classified projects, discussing weapons programs and research initiatives that were known only to personnel with the highest security clearances. It would appear to guards during their shifts, describing military operations that were being planned in other facilities thousands of miles away. The creature seemed particularly interested in nuclear technology, showing an understanding of atomic physics that impressed even the scientists working on weapons development. It would predict the results of tests before they were conducted, describe the effects of radiation exposure with medical precision, and discuss the long-term consequences of nuclear warfare with disturbing accuracy. Most alarming was the entity's apparent ability to influence the base's computer systems. Classified files would be accessed without leaving any trace in the security logs. Communications would be intercepted and altered before reaching their intended recipients, and launch codes would be mysteriously changed without authorization. The creature seemed to understand the base's entire operational structure, knowing exactly how to manipulate systems to create maximum chaos and confusion. Our final case brings us full circle to an encounter that demonstrates the ultimate goal of demonic entities: the complete corruption and destruction of human souls. In a small monastery in Tibet, monks documented a possession that lasted for an entire year, during which the victim was transformed from a devoted spiritual seeker into something barely recognizable as human. Brother Michael, a Western monk who had spent 15 years studying Buddhist meditation, became the target of an entity that seemed determined to prove that no amount of spiritual preparation could protect against demonic assault. The possession began subtly, with small doubts and negative thoughts that gradually grew into overwhelming despair and hatred. The entity worked systematically to destroy everything that had given meaning to Brother Michael's life. It would force him to blaspheme against the teachings he had devoted his life to studying, to feel hatred toward the fellow monks he had considered family, and to experience desires that violated every vow he had taken. The creature seemed to take particular pleasure in corrupting his memories, turning moments of spiritual insight into sources of anguish and self-doubt. What made this case particularly tragic was watching the transformation of a man who had achieved remarkable spiritual development. Brother Michael had been known for his compassion, wisdom, and inner peace. Under the entity's influence, he became violent, manipulative, and filled with malice toward everything he had once held sacred. The demon seemed to be demonstrating that no human being, regardless of their spiritual attainments, was beyond its reach. The exorcism that finally freed Brother Michael required the combined efforts of Buddhist lamas, Catholic priests, and spiritual practitioners from multiple traditions. Even then, the entity fought with a ferocity that suggested it considered this possession a crucial victory in its war against human spirituality. When it was finally expelled, Brother Michael was left broken and traumatized, requiring years of healing to recover from the psychological and spiritual damage that had been inflicted. These 33 encounters represent just a fraction of the documented cases of demonic activity that occur around the world. Each one reveals the same terrifying truth: we are not alone in this universe, and the forces that share our reality are not benevolent. They possess intelligence that surpasses our own, power that transcends our understanding, and malice that defies comprehension. They study us, manipulate us, and seek to corrupt everything that makes us human. The evidence is overwhelming, the testimonies are consistent across cultures and centuries, and the threat is real. The Doris Bither case from 1974 stands as one of the most disturbing and well-documented encounters in paranormal history. What happened to this single mother of four in her Culver City home would inspire the terrifying film The Entity, but the real events were far more horrifying than any movie could portray. Doris claimed she was being repeatedly attacked and sexually assaulted by invisible entities. 3 beings to be exact, 2 smaller ones that would hold her down while a larger one forced itself upon her. The bruises on her body were real, witnessed by investigators. The terror in her voice was undeniable. But what made this case truly chilling was that respected parapsychologists from UCLA actually studied it. Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor spent 10 weeks investigating Doris's claims. They documented poltergeist activity, strange lights, foul odors, and temperature drops. Objects fell from shelves without explanation. But it was during one investigation that they captured something extraordinary on film. A ball of light, clear as day, hovering in the room. Multiple witnesses saw it. The photograph still exists today. The entities didn't just attack Doris physically. They followed her family wherever they moved, feeding off their fear and desperation. Her children lived in constant terror, watching their mother being brutalized by forces they couldn't see or fight. The psychological trauma was immense, lasting decades after the attacks finally stopped. What makes the Doris Bither case so significant is the level of documentation. This wasn't just one person's word against the world. Multiple investigators, photographs, witness testimonies, and physical evidence all pointed to something genuinely supernatural occurring. The woman had a troubled past, yes, but that doesn't explain away the documented phenomena that multiple people experienced. Moving from California to the mountains of Idaho, we encounter a case that would terrify even the most experienced outdoorsman. A seasoned hunter, someone who had spent his entire life in the wilderness, would come face to face with something that defied all natural explanation. He was hunting alone in the Bitterroot Wilderness when he first saw it through his rifle scope. A human figure hanging impossibly high in a lodgepole pine, 30 feet off the ground. At first, he thought it was a corpse, maybe someone who had fallen from a tree stand. But then the figure moved. It turned its head toward him and smiled. But this wasn't any normal smile. The mouth stretched far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. Too many teeth, all unnaturally white and wet. The thing stared directly at him through his rifle scope, as if it knew exactly where he was standing miles away. That night, as he huddled in his tent, he heard dragging sounds above him, something heavy being pulled across the tree branches overhead. Pine needles pattered down onto his tent. When he finally worked up the courage to look outside, he saw it hanging directly above his campsite. Pale, sickly skin, long fingers wrapped around pine bark, those same worn jeans and flannel shirt from the day before. The hunter tried to flee the next morning, but the thing followed him. It moved through the trees with impossible speed and silence, always staying just out of clear sight, but making its presence known. An elk carcass appeared hanging 15 feet in the air, twisted and stretched as if some immense force had wrenched it upward through branches too dense to allow passage. Then he met the old trapper who had seen it before. The locals called it the Taker. It stalked from above, took what it wanted, and left the rest behind like trash in a tree. The trapper's words were chilling. "You saw its smile means it marked you. Best leave now." But the hunter couldn't escape that easily. The thing used voices to torment him. His dead brother's voice calling for help, his own voice whispering threats back at him. It rearranged his camp while he slept, organizing his gear with disturbing precision. A small noose made from sinew hung from the branches above his tent, swaying gently in the still air. When he finally encountered the creature face to face on the trail, it was beyond anything human. Pale skin stretched tight over jutting bones. Eyes like narrow slits, that grotesque mouth filled with far too many sharp teeth. The thing didn't attack immediately. It savored his terror, feeding off his fear before he managed to escape using an emergency flare. The hunter made it out alive, but the entity left its mark. Even months later, he would wake to the sound of something dragging across his roof. Pine needles would appear on his pillow, silent reminders that it was still watching, still waiting. These cases demonstrate a crucial pattern in demonic encounters. The entities don't just appear randomly, they're drawn to vulnerability, trauma, and spiritual openness. Doris Bither was living in poverty with a history of abuse. The hunter was alone in an isolated wilderness where something ancient and evil had made its home. Dr. Richard Gallagher, who has consulted on more demonic possession cases than any other physician in the world, explains that these entities are patient. They don't enter someone's life and leave cleanly. They hang around for months or years, gradually increasing their influence and control. What starts as minor disturbances escalates to physical attacks, psychological torment, and complete domination. The geographic distribution of these encounters is telling. While we might expect most cases to come from traditionally haunted regions like the American South, paranormal researchers have found that some of the most intense demonic activity occurs in unexpected places. New Jersey, Idaho, rural Pennsylvania. It seems these entities are drawn to isolation and desperation rather than specific locations. The evidence supporting these encounters goes beyond mere testimony. Audio recordings capture voices speaking in languages the victims don't know. Photographs document unexplained lights and shadows. Medical records show injuries that can't be explained by normal means. Police reports detail destroyed property and witnesses to supernatural events. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is how the entities adapt to modern life. They manipulate electronics, interfere with recording equipment, and seem to understand human psychology with frightening precision. They know exactly which buttons to push, which fears to exploit, and how to gradually break down their victims' resistance. The Bither case revealed something especially sinister about these entities. They don't just attack randomly, they have preferences, targeting those who are already struggling with trauma, addiction, or mental health issues. But rather than being products of these conditions, the demonic activity often makes existing problems worse, creating a vicious cycle of torment. The hunter's encounter shows how these entities can claim territory. The thing in the Idaho wilderness had been there for generations, claiming victims and leaving evidence of its presence carved into the very trees. The drag marks covering every branch told a story of countless encounters over decades or centuries. Both cases also demonstrate the importance of spiritual intervention. Doris eventually found relief through religious counseling and moving away from the source of the attacks. The hunter escaped by invoking the name of God when confronted directly by the entity. These aren't coincidences. They represent a fundamental truth about the nature of these encounters. The entities feed on fear, despair, and spiritual emptiness. They grow stronger when their victims feel helpless and alone. But they weaken when confronted with genuine faith, community support, and spiritual protection. This is why so many cases involve people who have become isolated from their support systems, or who have experimented with occult practices that opened them to demonic influence. The most chilling aspect of these encounters is their intelligence. These aren't mindless monsters or natural predators. They demonstrate planning, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature. They know how to manipulate situations to maximize their victims' terror and desperation. They're strategic in their approach, gradually escalating their attacks until their victims feel completely powerless. The documentation of these cases serves a crucial purpose. By recording and studying these encounters, researchers can identify patterns and develop better ways to help victims. The audio tapes from the Annalise Michel case, the photographs from the Bither investigation, and the witness testimonies from countless other encounters all contribute to our understanding of a phenomenon that affects thousands of people worldwide. What emerges from studying these cases is a picture of an ongoing spiritual war. Ancient entities that have existed since the beginning of time continue to seek ways to corrupt and control human souls. They adapt their methods to each generation, but their ultimate goal remains the same: total domination of their victims and the spread of evil in the world. The most important lesson from these encounters is that nobody has to face these entities alone. While they're real and dangerous, they're not all-powerful. They can be resisted, banished, and defeated through proper spiritual intervention and community support. We've covered 27 cases of demonic encounters, from the haunted forests of Pennsylvania to the isolated mountains of Idaho, from possessed children to tormented families. But as we approach the end of our journey through these 33 documented encounters, we need to examine 3 cases that stand apart from the rest. These final encounters reveal something crucial about the nature of demonic activity: its ability to infiltrate our most sacred spaces, target our most vulnerable populations, and manipulate the very technology we depend on. Case 28 takes us to St. Catherine's Catholic School in rural Vermont, where in 2018, what began as routine maintenance work uncovered something far more sinister. The school had been experiencing electrical problems for months: lights flickering, computers crashing, and the heating system cycling on and off at random intervals. The maintenance staff assumed it was old wiring, but when they opened up the walls in the basement, they found something that defied explanation. Carved deep into the wooden support beams were symbols that predated the school by decades. These weren't random scratches or graffiti. They were deliberate, intricate markings that formed patterns around specific areas of the building. A local historian identified them as binding symbols, similar to those found in cases of demonic imprisonment. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The symbols were carved from the inside of the walls, in spaces no human could have accessed during construction. Sister Margaret, who had worked at the school for over 30 years, admitted that strange incidents had been occurring for as long as she could remember. Children would complain about voices coming from the walls during prayer time. Multiple students reported seeing a tall, dark figure in the basement corridor, always just out of clear sight. The kindergarten teacher noted that several young children had drawn identical pictures of a horned creature, despite never discussing such images in class. The most chilling incident occurred during a Christmas pageant rehearsal. 8-year-old Emma Collins was practicing her lines when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and began speaking in what witnesses described as an ancient language. Her voice deepened unnaturally, and she spoke with an authority that was completely contrary to her normal personality. The words she spoke were later identified by a linguistics professor as Aramaic phrases related to judgment and damnation. When the school brought in Father Rodriguez to perform a blessing, the electrical disturbances intensified dramatically. During the ceremony, every electronic device in the building activated simultaneously. Computers turned on by themselves, the fire alarm blared, and the intercom system began broadcasting what sounded like multiple voices speaking in different languages. The temperature in the basement dropped so suddenly that frost formed on the walls in the middle of December, with the heating system running full blast. What makes this case particularly significant is how the entity seemed to specifically target the children's faith. During religion classes, students would become inexplicably agitated. Crucifixes would fall from walls, and holy water would evaporate from containers overnight. The demon wasn't just haunting the building, it was actively working to corrupt the spiritual education taking place there. Case 29 brings us to the Riverside Nursing Home in Ohio, where elderly residents began reporting visitations from deceased relatives in 2019. At first, staff dismissed these as common hallucinations associated with aging and medication. But when multiple residents began describing identical encounters with the same entity, the situation became impossible to ignore. 82-year-old Harold Morrison was the first to report seeing his deceased wife Martha in his room. She would appear at the foot of his bed, looking exactly as she had on the day she died, and would speak to him in a voice he recognized. But Martha had been dead for 15 years, and what she was saying horrified Harold. She told him that death wasn't peaceful, that she was suffering, and that she needed him to join her soon. Within weeks, 6 other residents reported similar visitations from their deceased spouses. Each encounter followed the same pattern. The deceased would appear looking exactly as they had at death, would claim to be suffering in the afterlife, and would attempt to convince the living resident to end their own life to join them. The consistency of these reports was deeply troubling to the nursing home staff. Nurse Patricia Williams documented several incidents where residents would be found in their rooms speaking to empty air, carrying on full conversations with invisible entities. When she reviewed the security footage, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. During these conversations, the residents' shadows would move independently of their bodies, gesturing and reacting to the invisible presence. The situation escalated when Harold Morrison was found attempting to harm himself, claiming that Martha was becoming more insistent that he join her. Other residents began showing similar self-destructive behaviors, all claiming their deceased loved ones were demanding they end their lives. The entity had found a particularly cruel way to exploit the grief and loneliness of the elderly, masquerading as their beloved deceased partners to manipulate them toward death. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the residents, noted that these weren't typical grief hallucinations. The residents were receiving specific information about people and events they couldn't have known about. The entity masquerading as their deceased spouses knew intimate details about their marriages, their children, and their past that went beyond what could be explained by memory or wishful thinking. When a local priest performed blessings in the affected rooms, the activity initially intensified. Residents reported that their deceased spouses became angry and more demanding. But gradually, after repeated interventions and the installation of religious symbols throughout the facility, the visitations ceased. However, the psychological damage had been done. Several residents never fully recovered from the trauma of believing their beloved spouses were suffering in death and trying to drag them into that suffering. Our final case, number 30, takes us into the digital age with an encounter that demonstrates how demonic entities are adapting to modern technology. In 2020, during the height of the pandemic, when online church services became the norm, congregations around the world began reporting disturbing interruptions to their virtual worship services. Reverend Michael Torres of Grace Community Church in Phoenix was conducting a Sunday service via video conference when something unprecedented occurred. During his sermon about spiritual warfare, an unknown participant joined the call. The username showed only as symbols that resembled ancient script, and while the video feed showed nothing but darkness, audio began playing that chilled everyone on the call. A voice, deeper and more resonant than any human voice could be, began speaking over the Reverend's sermon. It wasn't speaking English, but somehow everyone understood what it was saying. It was mocking their faith, challenging their beliefs, and making specific threats against individual congregation members. The voice knew personal details about people on the call, referencing their private struggles, their secret sins, and their deepest fears. What made this encounter particularly disturbing was that the entity couldn't be removed from the call. Church IT volunteers tried every technical solution they could think of. They changed passwords, ended and restarted the meeting, and even switched to different platforms, but the entity followed them everywhere. It had somehow infiltrated their digital worship space and was using their own technology against them. The phenomenon spread to other churches attempting online services. Pastors across the country reported similar intrusions, always during moments of worship or prayer. The entity seemed particularly drawn to churches that were experiencing growth or revival. It would interrupt baptisms, communion services, and prayer meetings, always with the same goal of disrupting worship and spreading fear among the faithful. Technology experts who investigated these incidents found no logical explanation. The intrusions weren't coming from any identifiable source. They bypassed security measures that should have been impenetrable and demonstrated capabilities that exceeded current technological understanding. The entity was manipulating digital systems in ways that defied the laws of computer science. Dr. Amanda Foster, a cybersecurity expert who specializes in unexplained digital phenomena, documented over 300 similar incidents across 47 states. In each case, the intrusion followed the same pattern. An unknown entity would join digital religious services, demonstrate supernatural knowledge about participants, and prove impossible to remove through conventional technical means. The solution, when it came, wasn't technological but spiritual. Churches found that traditional spiritual warfare techniques worked even in digital spaces. Prayer, blessing of the equipment, and spiritual authority exercised by church leaders could banish these digital demons just as effectively as they worked against physical manifestations. These three cases reveal crucial truths about modern demonic activity. First, demons actively target places of worship and spiritual education. recognizing these as threats to their influence. Second, they exploit human vulnerability, particularly among those who are isolated or emotionally fragile. Third, they're adapting to modern technology, finding new ways to infiltrate our lives through the digital systems we depend on. The consistency across these encounters is remarkable. Whether in a Catholic school, a nursing home, or a digital worship service, the demonic entities demonstrate the same characteristics: intimate knowledge of human weaknesses, ability to manipulate physical and digital environments, and a focused intent to destroy faith and spread despair. What's particularly disturbing is how these modern manifestations combine traditional demonic behaviors with contemporary methods. The entity in the school used both ancient symbols and modern electrical systems. The nursing home demon exploited both grief psychology and security technology. The digital demon combined supernatural knowledge with advanced cyber capabilities. These cases also demonstrate that spiritual warfare has evolved with the times. Exorcists and spiritual counselors now need to understand not just traditional demonology, but also modern psychology and technology. The battlefield has expanded from haunted houses and possessed individuals to include schools, healthcare facilities, and cyberspace. The evidence from these encounters suggests that demonic activity is becoming more sophisticated and targeted. Rather than random hauntings or possessions, these entities are conducting coordinated campaigns against specific vulnerable populations and institutions. They're studying human behavior, exploiting our dependencies on technology, and finding new ways to undermine faith and community. As we prepare to conclude our examination of these 33 wildest demon encounters, these final 3 cases serve as a stark reminder that the spiritual realm is not separate from our modern world, but intimately connected to it. The ancient battle between good and evil continues to rage, but now it's being fought in classrooms, hospital rooms, and computer networks, as well as in traditional haunted locations. The demons of the 21st century are not bound by the limitations that confined their predecessors. They've learned to navigate our interconnected world, to exploit our technological dependencies, and to find us wherever we seek community, comfort, or spiritual connection. As we reach the final encounters in our exploration, we turn to cases that demonstrate how these demonic forces adapt and evolve with our modern world. These contemporary encounters show entities that exploit our technology, infiltrate our digital spaces, and prey upon the vulnerabilities of modern life in ways our ancestors never could have imagined. Case 31 takes us into the realm of digital possession, a phenomenon that's emerged alongside our increasing dependence on technology. Sarah Chen, a 24-year-old software developer from Seattle, began experiencing what she initially dismissed as technical glitches in her smart home system. Her lights would flicker in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. Her smart speakers would activate in the middle of the night, playing distorted audio that sounded like backwards speech, and her security cameras would capture moving shadows in empty rooms. But the digital disturbances escalated beyond simple malfunctions. Sarah's computer would open files she had never created, filled with symbols that matched those found in historical grimoires and occult texts. Her phone would receive calls from her own number, and when she answered, she would hear her own voice speaking in languages she didn't recognize. The entity had learned to manipulate the very foundation of modern life, turning the tools we depend on into instruments of psychological warfare. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered that the binary code appearing in her corrupted files, when translated, formed coherent messages in Latin and Hebrew. The entity wasn't just randomly causing technical failures, it was communicating through the language of computers themselves. Security footage from her apartment complex showed electromagnetic anomalies that coincided perfectly with each supernatural event, suggesting that whatever was haunting her had learned to exist within and manipulate electrical systems. Case 32 brings us to Marcus Thompson, a paramedic from Chicago who encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between life and death. During a routine emergency call to an abandoned warehouse, Marcus and his partner discovered a scene that defied medical explanation. They found 17 homeless individuals in what appeared to be a state of suspended animation. Their vital signs so faint they were barely detectable, yet they remained conscious and aware. The victims described being held in this state for weeks, unable to move or speak while something fed on their life force. They spoke of a presence that moved between them like a shadow, draining their energy while keeping them just alive enough to continue the process. Medical examinations revealed severe anemia and muscle atrophy consistent with prolonged immobilization, yet there were no restraints or physical evidence of captivity. What made this case particularly disturbing was the entity's apparent evolution in feeding methods. Rather than the violent possessions and dramatic manifestations we see in historical cases, this creature had developed a more efficient, systematic approach to harvesting human energy. It had learned patience, sustainability, and how to remain undetected by authorities for extended periods. Our 33rd and final case represents perhaps the most chilling evolution of demonic activity: the exploitation of social isolation and digital addiction. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a psychiatrist specializing in technology addiction, documented a cluster of cases among young adults who had become completely withdrawn from physical social interaction, living entirely through online platforms and virtual reality. These individuals, ranging in age from 18 to 25, had gradually become convinced that their online personas were more real than their physical selves. They reported encounters with entities that existed purely in digital spaces, beings that could manipulate their virtual environments, alter their avatars without permission, and communicate through glitches in video games and social media platforms. The entity in these cases demonstrated an unprecedented level of sophistication, creating false memories of digital experiences that felt more vivid and meaningful than real-world interactions. Victims would spend days in virtual reality, convinced they were building relationships and achieving goals, only to discover that their supposed accomplishments were fabrications created by something that understood exactly how to exploit their deepest psychological needs for connection and purpose. Brain scans of affected individuals showed unusual activity in regions associated with addiction and dissociation, as if the entity had learned to trigger specific neurochemical responses that kept victims trapped in digital spaces where it could maintain complete control over their perception of reality. These modern encounters reveal that demonic forces haven't remained static throughout history. They've adapted to our technological age with frightening efficiency, learning to exploit our dependence on digital systems, our social isolation, and our blurred boundaries between virtual and physical reality. They've evolved from the dramatic, attention-grabbing manifestations of previous centuries to more subtle, systematic methods of influence and control. What makes these contemporary cases particularly alarming is their scalability. Where historical possessions typically affected individuals or small groups, these digital age entities can potentially reach thousands of people simultaneously through networked systems. They've learned to weaponize our own innovations against us, turning the very technologies we created to connect and empower ourselves into tools of spiritual warfare. The evidence suggests that these forces are not only active but evolving, studying human behavior and adapting their methods to exploit our modern vulnerabilities. They've moved beyond haunted houses and possessed individuals to infiltrate the digital infrastructure that increasingly defines our reality. As we become more dependent on technology and more isolated from genuine human connection, we may be inadvertently creating the perfect conditions for these entities to expand their influence in ways we're only beginning to understand. These 33 encounters, spanning centuries and continents, paint a clear picture. Demonic forces are real, they are intelligent, and they are actively working to corrupt, control, and ultimately claim human souls. They operate according to their own rules, exploit our vulnerabilities with surgical precision, and adapt to our changing world with disturbing efficiency. The evidence is overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the implications profound. These 33 encounters remind us that the veil between our world and darker realms is thinner than we'd like to believe. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, these stories serve as a chilling reminder to respect the unknown and trust your instincts when something feels wrong. If you've had your own demonic encounter, remember that you're not alone, and there are ways to protect yourself through faith, prayer, and seeking help from those who understand these dark forces. Stay safe out there, and may you never find yourself face to face with the entities described in these terrifying tales.